Okay, so in this lecture, I just want to give you guys kind of an introduction to Kant. I want to say a little bit about Kant's method, make sense of some of the jargon he uses, and also just say a little bit about what to expect, what the argument in outline, or at least what the steps of the argument will be in the first part of the groundwork. But first, let's start talking about the preface and some of the stuff he says there, and also what he's doing, what he's saying. Okay, so one thing that's really tough about Kant is that he loves his jargon. He loves using his own specialized philosopher's jargon. I've read a lot of Kant. It's very annoying. And you guys might have been mystified, you might have been confused by this talk of a priori. Now this ties up with a lot of other stuff in Kant's philosophical system. This word has a lot of baggage with it. Most of that you can just ignore. But let me say what's important about it for our purposes. Now, a priori is a bit of Latin. It just means you can know something independent of experience. You don't need to have any particular experience to know this. It's the kind of knowledge you get from math, right? Look, to know that 1097 plus 4 is 1101, you don't need to go out and count 1097 things and then put the 4 with it and count it again, right? You don't need to actually have that experience of those many things. You can just do the math. You don't need any particular experience. Contrast that with, how do you know that squirrels in America are gray, right? You know that because you've seen a lot of squirrels. Anyway, don't get too tied up in that, but what Kant is getting at is that he wants, well, two things. He wants basic moral principles not to depend on any claims about human nature. Any claims that we might make, anything we might discover about human beings. Kind of like math, he doesn't want there to be any particular experience, any sort of thing like that our claims depend on, at least for our basic moral principles. And Kant also thinks that, like mathematics, moral principles are certain. They hold without exception. They are always the case. He wants the kind of certainty you see in mathematics for moral principles. I mean, think of it this way, right? If you add, always that 1097 plus 4 is going to be 1101. I have to think about that a bit. My math is really terrible. But look, you don't know that you'll never see a red squirrel, right? Squirrels you've seen so far are gray. You might see a red one tomorrow, right? There might be exceptions to this squirrels are gray rule. If you remember your high school geometry, every single triangle, the angles are always going to add up to 180 degrees, right? Kant, he wants that kind of certainty for morality. The basic principles of morality, at least. Now, I think it'll be important to say that Kant doesn't think that moral reasoning is going to be like mathematics. He's not like the utilitarians. He doesn't think that there is some kind of formula you can apply, but he does want the basic principles to have a sort of certainty that we might see in fields like mathematics. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, it will get clearer as we go along, I hope. But let me say a bit more about each of these claims. So the first of these is just that moral principles don't depend on human nature. Kant thinks you don't need to go out and observe human beings to know a lot about human nature to get moral claims. So why is that? Why does he want to say that? Well, part of this is just think about the problems we ran into with natural law theory, right? Natural law theory needs to make these claims about human nature, the things that by nature all human beings want, and as we saw at the end of the unit on natural law theory, that gets the natural law theorist into trouble, right? Why think that human nature is the way that he says it is? Why think that the features of human nature that he wants to point at are so important? And Kant will say, anytime our moral principles start depending on claims about human nature, they are going to be incredibly controversial. It's hard to know what human nature is. We want morality not to depend on those claims. But it's not just natural law theory that Kant would have a problem with. There are certain contemporary attempts. You might see people talking about evolution, how human beings supposedly evolved, say a little bit more about that. You might think, well, they'll say about how we evolved, they'll make claims about what our ethics should be, right? Or they'll scan the human brain and see that certain regions light up when we think about certain moral dilemmas, and they'll try to read off big facts about morality from that. Kant would also oppose that. Just as much as natural law theory, he doesn't want morality. He doesn't think that that's a good method for getting moral principles. Well, why is that? Well, remember, as I said, any claims about human nature are going to be controversial. The natural law theorists' claims about nature, given how they rest on a certain view of the world that's very closely tied to religion, we can see that, right? But, even modern attempts, today scientists say one thing about human nature, a year later we find that's not right, right? We're constantly discovering things. Any claims about human nature, at least for the foreseeable future, will be really uncertain, really provisional, really controversial. So Kant doesn't think that's a good foundation for moral principles. And another thing here is that Kant thinks we are sure of moral principles no matter what. We are really unsure about our claims about human nature. Some moral principles we are really sure about. And let me give you guys an example of this. So, look, we all think that murder is wrong, that you need a very good reason to kill another human being, and it's only in certain exceptional circumstances that that would be justifiable. But say that some scientists tomorrow, they make some discovery that by nature human beings are very aggressive, right? We find that our nearest ancestors in the natural world were particularly murdery, right? Well, look, you wouldn't read off from that fact that there's something in human nature that makes us really aggressive. You wouldn't read about that even if you were sure about it, even if the scientists gave you a good case. You wouldn't be like, oh, okay, well, murder's okay. I thought it wasn't, but we're hardwired, we're set up to be aggressive, so yeah, I guess it's okay to murder people. No, right? You would not think that no matter what the scientists or anybody else told you about human nature. Murder is wrong. We are sure of that, and no discoveries we might make about human nature are going to undermine our certainty that murder is wrong. So Kant thinks, we have a certainty of moral principles that just don't depend, that are independent of anything we find out about human nature. Now, another thing here, and this will be more important as we go along, Kant also thinks falling back on claims about human nature and trying to get claims about morality from that it doesn't do credit to what's special about human beings. Kant thinks that we'll talk about this in several lectures, but he thinks we have free will. And what that means is that what human beings do isn't set by our nature, whatever our nature might be. Let me give you an example of this. Years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine, and there were three of us. It was this guy we knew and another friend of mine, and lots of alcohol had been flowing, and our friend confessed to us that he had been cheating on his wife for years, right? We were disappointed. We were outraged. We didn't hide that very well. His wife was also a friend of ours. And his way of justifying this was to say, well, it's human nature. Humans did not evolve to be monogamous. It's nature of the male to not be faithful. Well, look, we both called BS on this. Why did we think that this was bull? Excuse my language, but I think there's no other word for it. Why did we call bull? Because he had made a choice, right? It's not as though as a human being, certain facts about human nature, whatever they might be, just determine you to do something. He had made a choice to cheat on his wife. Plenty of people don't do that. You have the freedom not to do that. Now, look, it might turn out that there's some fact about human nature that men are particularly tempted to do that. I don't believe that, by the way. But it might turn out to be the case. But if it did, we wouldn't think that lets people who choose to do that off the hook. Whatever the facts of human nature might be, you can still make a choice. And Kant would say, to point at facts of human nature and act like that sets your ethics, like that determines you, that denies human freedom. Look, that's what our friend was trying to do, right? He was trying to get himself off the hook for this choice he made by pointing at some fact about human nature. Kant would say that's a no-no. Now look, this is what I think Kant's getting at in the preface. This is what all that talk of a priori, a posteriori, all that means, right? The important thing is moral claims are supposed to be certain, and moral claims are not supposed to depend on any facts about human nature, any facts about what kind of creatures we might be. But Kant will say, look, how you apply your moral principles, your basic moral principles, I'm going to come up with, I think, unlike the natural law theorist, I'm not going to make any claims about what human nature is, what the purpose of humans in the natural order is. All that's going to be controversial, all that's going to be unsure. Look at the problems with natural law theory. I want to get a theory that avoids that. But Kant will say how we apply our basic moral principles, that actually might depend on facts about human nature. Look, if human beings face a really strong temptation to do certain things, that might mean that we will not think that certain behavior is okay, but that we might let people off the hook a little bit for it. If our friends' claim about men and promiscuity had been true, again, I don't think it is, but had it been true, we'd still think he did something wrong. We might dial our blame back a bit. And also think of this, right? The very way that certain principles are going to apply to us will depend on what kinds of creatures we are. Now, just to tip my cards a bit, Kant's whole morality is going to turn on respect. Unlike the natural law theorist, Kant's going to say it's respect for persons, respect for human beings, not these intrinsic goods, but this idea of respect will be important. But look, one of the ways that we can fail to show respect for other human beings is to lie to them. Kant is going to be very much against lying. But look, if human beings were all telepathic, if we could read each other's minds, you know, wouldn't even make sense to talk about a moral rule against lying. So Kant will say, well, given the kinds of creatures we are, this idea of respect means we shouldn't lie to each other because we as human beings can deceive each other. But if we were a different kind of creature, some kind of Star Trek alien that could read minds, well, we should still respect each other, but it wouldn't even make sense to think of a rule against lying. So hopefully, I hope the basic idea is clear to you guys. That will become clear as we go along. But the idea is basic moral rules can't be set by any claims about human nature, but facts about human nature might be relevant in how we apply the rules. So hopefully that distinction is relatively clear. This is basically what I've said in this lecture. This is the important stuff Kant is trying to get at in the introduction, or sorry, the preface. All right, so the last thing I want to say in this introductory lecture is just to talk about Kant's argument in outline. This is the argument of the first part of the groundwork, which you guys will read next. So I think you can think of this argument as Kant answering three questions. There's three steps here. And one thing I want y'all to be clear about is that, we might disagree with Kant on any of these steps. We might follow Kant to a certain point and then just sort of part ways with him. I'll say more about that as we go through the lectures. Also, I think this will be important. So first step of Kant's argument, how do we define what is good? Utilitarians will say pleasure in the absence of pain. Natural law theorists, we've already seen, will say these intrinsic goods. Kant will give a different answer. Kant will say we define what is good, what is good in terms of the goodwill. Goodwill, having a goodwill as a person, Kant will think is what defines this. We'll talk about the arguments he gives for that in the next lecture. Well, what is a goodwill? Kant will say that a goodwill is one that acts from a certain motive. It acts from the motive of duty. And what Kant means by this is a goodwill follows the moral rules, and it follows those moral rules because they are the right thing to do. Kant's goodwill, look. A goodwill is one that does something because it has a duty. Duties for Kant are set by moral rules. I mean, think about this, right? When you're very tempted to steal something, you don't steal because you think stealing is wrong. Kant will say that is an example of a goodwill. You don't do it because there's a moral rule against doing this kind of thing. That's the reason you don't steal. That is a goodwill. Contrast that with you don't steal because you might get caught. You're doing the right thing, but you're not doing it out of duty. You're not doing it for the right reason. Now, one thing that will be important here is how Kant defines the goodwill. We might agree with Kant that a goodwill is what's important, but are we so sure that we want to define the goodwill in terms of acting on duty, in terms of following the moral rules? The virtue theorist will probably go with Kant as far as this second step. They'll think, well, the goodwill is what's important, but Aristotle, other virtue theorists, as we'll see later in the semester, will define the goodwill in a different way. Final step in Kant's argument, how do we know what our duties are? Kant has a rules-based theory like the natural law theory, like divine command theory, so he needs to have some way of telling us what the moral rules are. And as we saw, with natural law theory and divine command theory, it's really problematic if to get those rules you need to make controversial claims. Controversial claims either about what God wills or about what human nature is. Well, Kant needs some method of getting the moral rules that doesn't depend on controversial claims like that. Kant's way of getting the moral rules are the so-called formulations of the categorical imperative. Now, Kant talks about 3 formulations here. There's only 2 that I'm really going to focus on: formula of universal law and the formula of humanity. These will tell us what the rules are. They will tell us what our duties are. I will explain a lot more what these formulations are in the upcoming lectures. One of the things I want you guys to keep in mind, though, do these formulations do the work Kant wants them to? Do they really tell us what our duties are, what the moral rules are? Okay, so that's Kant's argument and outline. We will start in the next series of lectures on this first step in Kant's argument. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on each step of this argument. Kant goes pretty quickly in the groundwork. We really shouldn't. We should take our time working through it.